A mountain begins to rumble. The ground shakes beneath your feet. Animals flee without hesitation. Hours later, an entire landscape disappears beneath rivers of ash, choking darkness and rock moving faster than a racing car. Cities vanish. Forests collapse. Rivers change course. Yet somehow humanity survives. Not once, but over and over again. The real miracle isn't that volcanoes buried civilizations. It's that our ancestors kept finding ways to outlive them. Volcanoes have shaped human history for far longer than recorded history itself. Long before kingdoms, pyramids, or written language existed, ancient humans shared the planet with some of the most violent eruptions Earth has ever produced. They had no geology, no satellites, no weather forecasts, and no emergency broadcasts. Everything they learned came from direct experience. Sometimes that experience was fatal. Sometimes it became the difference between survival and extinction. One of the greatest challenges is separating prehistoric events from famous historical disasters. When people think of volcanoes, they often imagine Pompeii. But by then, humans had already been living with volcanic landscapes for hundreds of thousands of years. Early hunter-gatherers repeatedly settled near volcanoes despite the danger. Why? Because volcanoes also offered remarkable advantages. Volcanic soils became extraordinarily fertile after weathering. Springs provided fresh water. Lava created caves that offered natural shelter. Obsidian, a volcanic glass, could be fractured into razor-sharp cutting tools far superior to many ordinary stones. The same mountains capable of destroying entire communities also supplied resources that made life easier. That dangerous bargain continued for thousands of generations. Now imagine facing one of the largest eruptions humanity has ever witnessed. About 74,000 years ago, the Toba supereruption in what is now Indonesia blasted enormous quantities of ash into the atmosphere. It remains one of the largest known volcanic eruptions of the last 2 million years. For years, scientists proposed a dramatic idea. Perhaps Toba nearly wiped out humanity. This became known as the volcanic winter hypothesis. According to this proposal, ash and sulfur released into the atmosphere may have cooled global temperatures, disrupted ecosystems, and reduced human populations to dangerously low numbers. It was a terrifying possibility. But modern evidence paints a more complicated picture. Archaeological discoveries in Africa and India suggest that some human populations survived without showing signs of complete collapse. Stone tool traditions continued across several regions, indicating that at least certain communities adapted instead of disappearing. Genetic studies still suggest our ancestors passed through periods of low population size, but whether Toba alone caused such a bottleneck remains heavily debated. That's an important lesson. Nature rarely leaves simple answers. What Toba certainly demonstrates is the astonishing resilience of early Homo sapiens. Faced with one of Earth's greatest volcanic catastrophes, our species endured. Not because the eruption was harmless, but because humans were already remarkably adaptable long before civilization existed. And that adaptability would soon become humanity's greatest defense against every volcano that followed. If ancient humans couldn't predict volcanic eruptions, how did they ever escape them? The answer begins with observation. Long before anyone understood magma chambers or tectonic plates, people understood patterns. Volcanoes rarely erupt without warning. Small earthquakes often become more frequent. Steam escapes from cracks in the ground. Springs change temperature or dry up altogether. Strange smells drift through the air as volcanic gases seep upward. Animals begin behaving differently, abandoning familiar grazing grounds or nesting sites. To a modern scientist, these are geological signals. To an ancient hunter, they were simply signs that something was terribly wrong. Communities living near active volcanoes would have experienced these warning patterns repeatedly across generations. Smaller eruptions taught lessons that could later save lives during larger ones. Oral traditions preserved those lessons long before writing existed. Nobody needed to know why the mountain was changing. They only needed to recognize that it always changed before disaster arrived. Experience became an early warning system. Volcanoes didn't only destroy landscapes, they reshaped human migration. Whenever an eruption covered forests with ash, poisoned rivers, or buried hunting grounds beneath thick volcanic deposits, survival demanded movement. Entire groups abandoned territories their ancestors had occupied for generations. Some traveled toward river valleys, others followed migrating animals into safer regions. A few may never have returned. Archaeologists have found repeated evidence that prehistoric populations were remarkably mobile. They were not tied permanently to one location. That flexibility became one of humanity's greatest evolutionary strengths. Instead of trying to conquer nature, they often moved with it. This ability to relocate quickly separated humans from countless other species restricted to smaller habitats. Ironically, disasters sometimes created opportunities. Fresh volcanic ash eventually weathered into nutrient-rich soil, capable of supporting abundant plant life. Herd animals returned to new grasslands. Rivers carved fresh channels through the landscape. Within years or decades, places that had seemed permanently destroyed could once again become attractive places to live. Ancient people understood something that still surprises us today. A volcanic landscape could be both deadly and generous. The same mountain that forced you to flee could one day feed your grandchildren. That cycle of destruction followed by renewal became one of the defining rhythms of life in volcanic regions, and later civilizations would learn that lesson in ways they could never forget. One of the clearest examples comes from an island in the Aegean Sea. Around 1600 BC, the volcano on Thera, now known as Santorini, erupted with extraordinary force. Entire sections of the island collapsed into the sea, creating the vast caldera that still exists today. The eruption blasted ash high into the atmosphere, triggered powerful tsunamis across the eastern Mediterranean, and covered nearby islands with volcanic debris. Yet one detail has fascinated archaeologists for decades. The ancient town of Akrotiri was buried beneath layers of ash, preserving houses, streets, colorful frescoes, and everyday objects with remarkable clarity. But very few human remains have been found. That absence speaks volumes. Many researchers believe the inhabitants recognized the warning signs before the catastrophic eruption reached its peak. A series of earthquakes likely damaged buildings, giving residents time to evacuate by sea. They appear to have taken valuable possessions with them, suggesting an organized departure rather than a sudden panic. The city was lost, its people probably were not. Thousands of years later, volcanic ash preserved their world so perfectly that archaeologists can still walk through its streets. Sometimes survival isn't measured by saving buildings, it's measured by knowing when to leave them behind. Now compare that story with one of history's most famous volcanic disasters. In AD 79, Mount Vesuvius erupted over the Roman cities of Pompeii and Herculaneum. For centuries, people imagined that the eruption struck without warning. Modern research tells a different story. The region had experienced earthquakes for years before the disaster, including a powerful quake in AD 62 that severely damaged Pompeii. Smaller tremors continued afterward. On the day of the eruption, ash began falling long before the deadly pyroclastic currents arrived. Many people escaped. Archaeologists estimate that a significant portion of Pompeii's population likely fled during the early stages of the eruption. Those who remained often did so because they underestimated the danger, stayed behind to protect property, cared for family members, or simply believed the mountain would calm down as it had before. The victims preserved in volcanic deposits represent tragedy. They do not represent everyone. Vesuvius teaches an uncomfortable lesson that still applies today. The greatest danger isn't always the eruption itself. Sometimes it's the human tendency to believe that tomorrow will be like yesterday, even when every warning sign says otherwise. And as civilizations became more advanced, surviving volcanoes depended on something even more powerful than strength or speed. It depended on memory, because the communities that remembered past disasters were often the ones best prepared for the next one. Memory became one of humanity's greatest survival tools. Long before geology became a science, stories carried life-saving information across generations. Around the world, many indigenous cultures preserved oral traditions describing mountains that breathed fire, rivers that suddenly changed course, skies that turned black at midday, and seas that rushed inland after violent eruptions. Modern researchers have found that some of these stories correspond remarkably well with geological evidence, preserving memories of real natural events for centuries. The stories weren't written as scientific reports. They didn't need to be. Their purpose was different. They warned people where not to build, when to leave, and which landscapes demanded respect. A child listening beside a fire might never realize that an elder's tale about an angry mountain was also an emergency manual disguised as tradition. Knowledge survived because the stories survived. And in dangerous environments, that could mean the difference between life and death. Surviving the eruption itself was only the beginning. The days that followed often proved just as difficult. Volcanic ash contaminated water supplies, buried crops, collapsed roofs, and made breathing painful for both people and animals. Livestock died from starvation or from eating ash-covered vegetation. Rivers became clogged with debris. Travel routes disappeared beneath thick layers of volcanic deposits. Communities suddenly faced a different enemy, not fire, hunger. Those who survived usually relied on the same strengths that had helped humans endure countless other disasters throughout prehistory. They shared food. They moved to unaffected regions. They traded with neighboring communities. They repaired tools instead of replacing them. They adapted their hunting and gathering strategies until the environment slowly recovered. Volcanoes rarely destroyed every community across an entire region. That mattered enormously. Groups living beyond the worst damage could provide shelter, food, knowledge, or even welcome displaced families into their own settlements. Human cooperation became a form of disaster insurance long before governments or organized relief systems existed. The recovery was never quick. Sometimes forests required decades to return. Sometimes farmland needed years before crops could grow again. Yet again and again people came back, because they understood something modern observers often overlook. Volcanoes could erase a home. They could not erase the human ability to rebuild. And that ability would eventually transform some of Earth's most dangerous landscapes into places where entire civilizations chose to flourish. Here's one of the greatest paradoxes in human history. Some of the world's most densely populated regions exist beside active volcanoes. At first glance, that seems irrational. Why would anyone willingly build a home beneath a mountain that has already proven it can destroy entire communities? The answer lies beneath your feet. Volcanic ash eventually breaks down into some of the most fertile soil on Earth. Crops often grow exceptionally well in these regions. Water is frequently abundant. Valuable minerals attract trade and industry. Forests regenerate. Wildlife returns. Within a generation or two, landscapes that once appeared lifeless can become remarkably productive. Ancient people noticed this long before scientists explained why. They accepted the risk because the rewards were extraordinary. The same cycle repeated across cultures, separated by thousands of kilometers. Eruptions forced people away. The land recovered. Families returned. Civilizations grew. Nature offered abundance, but only to those willing to live with uncertainty. Modern archaeology has revealed another remarkable truth. Volcanoes have accidentally become some of history's greatest archivists. Normally, wood decays, cloth rots, food disappears, entire buildings collapse into dust, but volcanic ash can seal a moment in time with astonishing precision. At Akrotiri, colorful wall paintings still decorate rooms abandoned more than 3,000 years ago. At Pompeii and Herculaneum, bakeries, workshops, streets, tools, and household objects remained preserved beneath volcanic deposits until archaeologists uncovered them centuries later. Even footprints, food, seeds, and everyday possessions survived because ash isolated them from air and moisture. Without those eruptions, much of that evidence would have vanished forever. It's a strange contradiction. The same force that ended lives also preserved countless details of ancient life. Volcanoes became unwilling historians. Every buried street, abandoned home, and preserved workshop allows modern researchers to understand how ancient people lived, worked, traded, cooked, worshipped, and adapted to the world around them. In trying to destroy history, the volcano accidentally protected it. And that brings us to the final lesson, a truth far bigger than any single eruption, one that explains why humanity repeatedly survived disasters capable of transforming entire landscapes. So how did ancient humans survive volcanic eruptions that buried cities? Not because they were stronger than nature. No one is. They survived because they observed, remembered, adapted, and moved when survival demanded it. Long before scientific instruments existed, people noticed subtle changes in the world around them. They watched animals abandon familiar paths. They felt earthquakes become more frequent. They saw steam rising from places where it had never appeared before. They learned, sometimes through terrible loss, that the mountain often whispered before it screamed. Every generation added another lesson. Communities passed those lessons through stories, traditions, and experience. Children grew into adults already knowing which valleys flooded first, which hills remained safe, and which mountains deserved caution even during years of quiet. Human survival wasn't based on predicting every eruption. It was based on learning from every previous one. That ability transformed disasters into knowledge, and knowledge became humanity's most valuable tool. When you look at the ruins of Pompeii, the buried streets of Akrotiri, or the immense volcanic deposits left by eruptions like Toba, it's easy to focus on what was lost. Entire towns disappeared, forests vanished, landscapes changed forever. But history tells another story hidden beneath the ash. People returned, again and again. They rebuilt homes on the slopes of volcanoes. They planted crops in newly fertile soil. They reopened trade routes. They raised families where previous generations had once fled for their lives. From a distance, that may seem reckless. In reality, it reveals something fundamental about our species. Humans have never survived because the world became safe. We survived because we refused to stop adapting when it became dangerous. Every volcanic eruption left scars on the land. Yet each one also revealed the same remarkable truth. Civilizations can fall. Cities can disappear beneath meters of ash. Entire landscapes can be transformed in a matter of hours. But the human instinct to observe, to learn, to cooperate, and to begin again has always been stronger than the silence left behind. Perhaps that's the greatest lesson every volcano has ever taught. The most powerful force in human history was never fire erupting from the earth. It was the quiet determination of people who, after watching the sky turn black and their world disappear beneath ash, still found the courage to build another home beneath the same mountain.